oh, I'm supposed to be writing a book. I've been writing for 25 years a book, right? So she says, Ruth, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to help you. And every Wednesday, I know Sydney's coming over. And because I know she's coming over, I've been writing my book. I'm still not finished, but I have been writing. And I thank you, Sydney, for everything. Anyway, I survived because of the goodness in people, in spite of the inhumanities. I was born in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power. Hitler, as you all know, have you heard about Hitler? Everybody? Okay, so he made it so that the Jews of Germany and of Europe would be exterminated. And my family was Jewish, and therefore it would happen to us. I don't know what my parents thought at the time, but I remember the first time that I knew something terrible was going on, and that's November 9th, 1938, when, I see, she loves you, huh? I have 3 daughters. And they felt that way about their daddy. He could do no wrong. Anyway, November 9th, 1938 was a night that we now call Kristallnacht, the night of the broken crystal. And that's when the Nazis came into our home with their axes and their hammers and just decided to break everything we owned. Our whole house was broken up. The only thing, and as a matter of fact, that I remember, and my sister always wondered how I remembered, but I did remember, the only thing that didn't break was a candle that was burning for my grandmother, who had just passed away. So you can imagine what that was like. Plus, that night, they took my father and my grandfather to the first internment camp, which was then called Dachau. It later became a killing camp, but then it was just for holding people who didn't want to be Nazis, and now the Jews. Not everybody wanted to be Nazi. You know that. Some people were even fighting Hitler, but it didn't work. Anyway, what took a few months, I don't know how long, my father did come home. He didn't look like my father anymore. He was thin and shaven, and I could tell my mom and dad were always talking together as if something was really wrong. I was 5 at the time, so if you can look back when you were 5 years old, you don't really know what's going on, you just know something's going on. Anyway, my mother left every day to try and get us to America. And on one of those days, she had told us, my sister was only 14 months older than me, so she had told my sister and I not to open the door for anyone. And sure enough, here comes the Nazis banging on our door. And Leah and I, her name was Leah, she passed away 12 years ago. I miss her still to this day and always. But anyway, the Nazis came to our door and we were making noises. We didn't want to hear them. And we looked out the window, and there on a truck were my mother and father, who had already been picked up. And I heard my mother say to come on down, and we did. Leah remembered packing, but I don't remember anything except getting on that truck. And that night we spent the night in the jailhouse of our little town, Ladenburg. You can imagine I'm now 7 and spending the night in the jailhouse. I just remember crying and my mom trying to calm me down, as mothers do. Anyway, the next morning the trucks came again and this time we were trucked to the nearby town of Mannheim. Mannheim is a big city in Germany, very industrial, very much bombed by the Americans. But anyway, that's where we lived, and now we were on our way to this train station, and there were boxcars waiting for us. And I don't remember that much about the actual trip, but France, I must tell you, is smaller than Texas. So we were like on one end of France, where Germany borders France, and it took them 3 days and 2 nights to finally wind up on the corner of, on the side where the Pyrenees and France, Spain and France meet up on the opposite side of the Mediterranean. And there was the concentration camp Gurs, G-U-R-S. And by the way, there were 34 camps in France, which hardly anyone knows about. Why? Because we had a General de Gaulle, who was the head of France right after the war. And he didn't want France to be known as Nazi or Vichy or whatever, because you know the French was anxious to get rid of the Jews at that time, as the Germans and as other European countries. Anyway, we arrived at the, excuse me, I'm a little bit nervous, I don't know why. I'm amongst friends.
It's
But
because
anyway.
Thompson's here. He can make people nervous.
Yeah, he's so gorgeous. Anyway, I remember arriving at this horrible place. It was mud everywhere, just horrible. And that's the first time they separated the men from the women. And that was the last time that I ever saw my daddy. They gave us straw to sleep on and a bowl to eat out of. And they told us where to go. I even remember the exact address, Ilom Barak 12. Crazy how you remember stuff. I can't remember the name of a friend, but I can remember that. Anyway, we were able to eat. I don't remember being hungry. But when you're 7 years old, I don't think you know hunger for, you know, because I know my own children and my grandchildren. I have 6 great-grandchildren. So I've seen them eating and they don't seem to be hungry. Now I'm hungry. But at that time, I don't remember being hungry. And yet we only had a bowl to eat out of. And in that bowl was some sort of soup with vegetables running around in it. But I think as long as I was with my mother, nothing could have hurt me. Or I remember walking in the morning. We used to have walks. That's what I remember. And I remember a barrack near our, we were in barracks, and each row, each bed or straw was laying next to the other bed. And I remember there was a barrack near our barrack, and there were women screaming all the time, night and day. These women were screaming. And I kept asking my mom, what were they screaming about? Why are they screaming? And it's almost like she didn't want to tell me, and finally she told me they had gone insane. And don't think that when I used to scream at my 3 girls, that didn't pop into my head. I better stop screaming. Yeah, it was very frightening. Anyway, one night we were sleeping, my sister and my mother woke us up, and she told us we had to get on the bus. I didn't want to get on the bus. She said we had to get on the bus. It seems that this agency of young people had managed to come into the camp pretending they were the Red Cross and seeing whether human rights were being observed. Naturally, they were not, but, and by the way, the dirt that I thought was dirt was really human excrement, because there were no bathroom facilities, no showers, no nothing. Anyway, these young people had managed to come into the camp and had looked for the mothers with children and talked to the mothers and told the mothers that they would take care of their children and they would do everything in their power and to make sure that we would survive and that they could come and pick us up at the end of the war. So screaming and crying, I got into the bus, and the last time that I ever saw my mom was waving goodbye to me from the back of the bus. Naturally, that was another thing I could never do, send my kids to camp. Had a different meaning in my mind. And also, waving goodbye was difficult. But anyway, we landed at this beautiful, it really wasn't beautiful, it was an old castle. France had a lot of old castles because they had kings and queens and on down. And these castles were bought by the Rothschild families, and they were bought strictly for saving children. And the castle was way away. We went there a couple of years ago, my girls and I, and my niece, and we could hardly find it. It was just far away from everything. And we got there, and we had lice, and we were shaven, and we were screaming, crying, because we wanted our parents. And they put us in the dungeon part of the castle, and there they made us sing. And they didn't have psychologists or psychiatrists or anything like that. They figured if we would sing, we couldn't cry, and it worked because eventually we did stop crying, and we were able to go down with the other children to play. But things were not good. The Nazis were everywhere, and they had told us that we should never tell anybody who we are. In fact, they changed my name to Regine. Regine, Ruth is too biblical. Leah, my sister Leah, we made Leah. And our last name was Krell. K-R-E-L-L, and they just spelled it the French way. And they told us we were now Catholic and that we can never tell anybody the truth about who we are or we'll get killed. And so we believed them, it was true. So as they were trying to find Jewish kids to kill them, think about it. Who told them to find Jewish kids and kill them? You know, it was just that way. In fact, there was a town near our town, and you can look it up, it's called Oradour-sur-Glane, where they found one Jewish child, put the whole town in the church, and set the church on fire with all the people in it. And they have left it now as a reminder of what happened. And there's a big, we went to visit, and there's a big museum showing all that happened. And there are the church and the buildings, and it's just unbelievable how they could have possibly done such a horrible thing. But we found this family, they found OSE, this agency, OSE, Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, Agency for the Rescue of Children. And they found a family that were willing to take two kids, which was very unusual. They would take one, but not two. And every day we would go to the schoolhouse. At the schoolhouse, the room was no bigger than this, and each row was a different grade. Can you imagine? You who go to such beautiful schools, to be in a room full of first graders and graduates. Pretty amazing how they even did it. I can't imagine. We went to look at it, and this one-room schoolhouse has now turned into somebody's lovely home. But at the time it was pretty bad. But every day at noon we would stop and go to church and learn catechism. France at that time was very Catholic. In fact, Protestants had to hide their religion. I don't know if you all know this, but it's true. And anyway, we went to catechism every day, and naturally we didn't know the prayers as well as the other children. And I think the priest kept our secret for as long as he could. And finally one day he told the town, the people, that he thought we were Jews. And I hated that priest for a long time till I found out that Oradour was like the little town next to our town, and he was probably trying to protect his 500 people in his town and not care about my sister and me. But what happened then is that we had to leave again. The Ose would always come in and take us away, and somehow we were in children's homes, we were in orphanages. There was a lot of that in France. People who didn't have parents, people who had, I guess, no money, and so we were always put in one of these houses. Somehow we were allowed to be hidden and never to tell anyone who we really were. And naturally, when they were chasing us out of the town, I loved the family we were with. They had a daughter, Paulette, and she was more my mother's age, and she was tough, but she was a wonderful person. And she let us sleep in her bedroom, and I remember being very sad that I had to leave again. And that's what we seem to have to do all the time, is just leave and say goodbye to the people that we had been with. Finally, the war was over, and I wanted to be Jewish again, so we were sent to a home that was Jewish. The Ose had this home near Paris, and for the first time I was Jewish again. And this was very important to me, because after all, my parents, I didn't know what happened to my parents, but I knew that they would want me to be Jewish and not Catholic. Not that there was anything wrong with being Catholic, but it was my duty to be what they would want me to be. And my sister felt the same way.
How old were you, Ruth, when the war was over?
At that point, we were 13 and 14. And suddenly we received a letter from my grandfather, who had managed to come to America and was living in New York. And he had read in the New York paper that children had been saved. And that's how, in 1946, on a crickety old boat, because there were 60 kids. You know how many captains would take 60 kids at once? And we probably, Lee and I, and there were another, the Kern, the Kahns, and the Krells, we were the youngest ones, but the others were already in their teenage years. And we were coming to wonderful America. By the way, when we got to New York, there was a big strike, and the boat couldn't come into the city, and we could see all the cars. far away where I could see the Riverside Drive. Now I know one. And I'd never seen so many cars in my life, you know. And we waited, and people would come on and rent boats to say hello to us. And they said, did you know so-and-so? Did you know this one? Did you know that one? Did they get saved? Or you? Naturally, we didn't know what the hell they were talking about because we were kids. There's just so much that we could handle. My sister had been very, very sick during the war. She had rheumatic fever, and there was no penicillin, so she was sick for a long time. She didn't even recognize me when it took me to see her in the hospital. And I just cried and cried and cried. I always cried and cried. I was a good crier. But anyway, she got better, and we came to America, and my grandfather was probably not that old. I don't really know how old he was, but he soon died of a bad heart. And again, we were just the two of us, and we couldn't be just by ourselves in the big city of New York. We could barely speak English at that point. And we went back to the agency that had helped us, Hyatt's, the one that they're honoring. And they're still busy now helping people from Russia and from all countries, Jews who are trying to get to safety. And we're honoring them at a dinner at the museum. I was very impressed with the fact that they would do that. Anyway, we went to the agency. They showed us this big map. We could barely speak English. And there's Minneapolis, and there's Seattle, and there's Houston, Texas. There's a street in New York called Houston, so they didn't know any better. But they told us Minneapolis was real cold, and Seattle was just too far from New York, and we wanted to go back to New York because we had made a couple of friends already. And my sister said, we're going to Houston. I know there's cowboys there, so we're going. And I always did what my big sister said we were going to do, and I did. And we arrived in Houston, Texas, and it was the biggest, I can't even tell you how sad it was, because in Houston, the Jews that were Houstonians had done very well after the war, or through the war, and nobody really wanted to know much about people like my sister and I, who didn't have a family. We were what they call war orphans. And again, we went to the Jewish Family Service, and they found a house where Leah could live, and she'd have to take care of the children, do light housework, and I would do the same thing in somebody else's house. And that was really bad, really, really bad, because we had no contact. We didn't have little phones that we could call, and in fact, we didn't have big phones we could talk. And to go from one end of Houston to not even another end, if you take a bus, you were all day on the bus. So my sister and I made a vow that she would finish school the best way possible and go to night school and learn shorthand and typing. And she would get us an apartment, and when she got that, then I would do the same thing. But back then, again, you have to think of 1952, 53, Houston didn't have apartments, didn't have anything. Really, they had quadruple their homes with, you know, two apartments on top and two on the bottom. Anyway, I saw a big sign as I was walking back to my place where I was staying, and it said secretary wanted. I was 16, you're supposed to be 17. So I got all the courage that I could muster up, and I walked into this place. It was called at the time Zero Foods Company. It later became Cisco Foods.
Wow. Yeah.
Anyway, Mr. Barr invited me into his office, and the first question he asked me what church I belonged to. Thank God I didn't lie. I didn't really belong to any church, but I knew that I would never tell him I was Jewish. I mean, what did that bring me ever? So I said, I don't belong to a church. Anyway, he hired me. And back then, all the restaurants and the country clubs, they all had French chefs. And I could only speak French very well, you know. So I became the official person on the telephone talking to all these chefs. But anyway, he was very good to me. He took me every week to the Second Baptist Church. Y'all who go to the Baptist Church? No.
We just go to
Baptist school.
Baptist school.
Anyway, he took me, and when a book was written about him, I'm chapter 8. And the book is called From Waco to Wall Street.
Oh.
And the reason I'm written up in the book is my sister at that time worked for Mr. Sir Baker Botts, and she was a top-notch secretary, even though she was never finished college, nothing, not even when we barely finished high school. Anyway, one morning, it was during the high holy days. We Jewish people have their holy days in September, October. I hear my sister on the phone, Mr. Ball, my sister won't be in today. We're Jewish, and we have a big high holiday, and we can't go to work. Oh my God, if I could have killed her, I would have. Because I hadn't told Mr. Ball that I was Jewish. Anyway, the next day,